Um, John, I want to say that it's a
Shalom, namaste.
namaskaram. I
Everybody okay?
yeah, I want to introduce you briefly,
Yes.
and first I want to say that it's a great joy for me to be here on behalf of Sahapedia and to be able to see you and to have this interview. It's a great pleasure and an honor. Um, because this is a recorded interview, let me just introduce you briefly, okay?
I know. Well, I understand, of course, that you are going to ask the questions, but I do want to say a few words first, if you don't mind. Um,
Please.
and that
Sure.
is, of course, firstly, how delighted I am at being asked by Sahapedia and Shruti uh, Chakravarti to do this interview with somebody who is a dear friend and was by far one of the best students that I had at SOAS, School of Oriental African Studies, which in those days was a place of bliss, shall we say. And of course, David Shulman is himself an authority on Tamil and Tamil literature and so on. And I have here, David, of course, your book, which should be required reading for
Oh,
everybody. That one. And David, of course, wrote an earlier book on one of my I suppose you could call it a hero or an anti-hero, and that is the Shiva devotee of the 63 Myanmar, that is Sundarar. And David wrote a book called The Harsh Devotee. And I do remember, David, we had a bit of a problem. I couldn't agree about harsh. I
ah,
someone who was such a very human person.
yeah.
And so therefore valorous or something. This is called Fantonder, to give it
Yes.
this Tamil sobriquet. But I believe I've been asked to talk about, as it were, my career. Now, my career, as I think I told you on the telephone, I don't want to talk about. I want to talk about one of the things that, in fact, you have raised in your notes. And that was how I came to be interested in India and Indian music in the first place.
That would be very good. Let's begin with that.
In the meanwhile, since we spoke, I've chased up my school diaries, and I found that it's actually January the 9th, 1944, when I was 16 and a half. And there's an entry in my diary which will amuse you hugely. It says, listened to Hindu music. Didn't say Indian music, and even less did it say film music or filmy geet or Bollywood, because Bollywood hadn't been invented in those days anyway. And so it simply said, listen to Hindu music. Now,
How did it happen?
yes, I did, from a very musical family. My mother was a pianist, and she was, although in those days the university wouldn't acknowledge music as a degree subject, so the Royal Academy of Music had to be content with doling out licentiates, which makes one sound like an owner of a pub or something. Anyway, my mother was a pianist. My father was a very keen classics musician himself. So I was brought up on a heady brew of Bach, Handel, and then because of my Catholic schooling, Palestrina, Bird, and so on, and singing. And my parents very soon found that I was no good at any instrument. I didn't have the brain eye manual coordination. So, well, let him sing because it appears to be the only thing he can do. And so singing I did. And I'm delighted. I think I see in the background in your picture, I think you have a tambura there.
Yes, it's a Tanjavur tambura.
And anyway, so singing was my classical Western background, which stood me in good stead for later. But what about Indian music? Because of my musical background, I was curious to hear this music. I won't give some of my schoolboy confederates what they thought about it when they had to listen to it on the school radio, because I had monopolised it every Sunday. The BBC, in those days a civilised organisation, the BBC had an Indian Forces programme. It said for the Indian Forces. And of course, it turned out to be Forces' favourites. In other words, it was filmy geet of the period. And so a lot of old film tunes I still know many years later, much to the shock, I think, of one or two of my confederates at Paratia Vidyabavan, where somebody said, "Oh, well, Dr. Marr wouldn't know that." And I immediately burst into the particular melody that he was talking about, because I had heard them at school. Now, with that curiosity and nosiness, I suppose at the age of about 17, one school holidays, World War II, by the way, was still on. But towards the end of World War II, I marched up to the BBC and asked to meet the Indian programme organisers. Now, I remember this very well. I wasn't shown the door. I didn't look like a German spy or anything suspicious. So I was allowed in to the Eastern service of the BBC, which in those days was in the Peter Robinson building, just opposite Oxford Street Station, which I'm sure you will know well. And I met somebody there who was actually from Jammu himself. His name was Bakshi Prem. And he took me under his wing. I was given a cubicle to listen to records to my heart's content. The lady who ran the whole show was Princess, wait a minute, I shall remember, Maharaj Kumari Indra Devi. She was Princess of Kapurthala, which is, you know, it's a small state up in Punjab. And she ran the show. And at the same time, and this is important in view of things that happened later in my life, there was somebody there called Narayana Menon who was being trained, I guess, for BBC broadcasting work, and eventually became Director General of what in those days was All India Radio, and became Akashvani. Dare I say it, they pinched the name Akashvani from the old radio Mysore. In the days when Mysore was a princely state and we had our own radio station, it was called Akashvani. Anyway, so all these things happened. Now, again, you could say, do we want to say Brigu Shastra, the hand of fate, or what? But I went, this was by then the end of the war, I had been accepted for, believe it or not, RAF training as a pilot, because I wanted to fly an aeroplane. I did fly an aeroplane a couple of times, but that's another story. But because the war in the West had come to the end, although we were still fighting the Japanese, they weren't training any more aircrew. So I went in despair to my old school to see the careers master, you know, because you had to do something, you had to volunteer, or you were called up into the army and put peeling potatoes or something. So I went to my old school. I never got to see this chap. How come? In the drive, I met a boy who was already in Indian Army uniform. He was a classmate of mine called Maya, and his father was in the old Indian Civil Service. And he said, "Oh, if you're mad about Indian music, why don't you join us?" So I rang up the military department of what is now, of course, our High Commission, and got an interview. I was asked a couple of questions. too perfunctory to bore you with. Oh yes, well that's all right. And so I was accepted as an officer cadet for the Indian Army, British Indian Army, remember. And so that happened. I joined up on the 1st of January 1946 in the depth of winter on the North Downs, a place called Rootham, and the winter appeared to last a month longer than anywhere else. And eventually, in August 1946, although by then the Independence of India Act had been passed, we were still sent to India for training. And it was where I went for training, David. That was what was the first step change in this whole story. Being that I was sent to Bangalore.
Luckily.
I was sent to Bangalore, and in Bangalore, in our mess radio, I heard this unearthly sound. What on earth could this be? It was so magnificent and so multi-textured, aesthetically and emotionally, as it were. And I realized there had to be something in this. And of course, this was South Indian or Carnatic classical music. And that's what started it all. It was being sent by the army to Bangalore rather than the alternatives, which would have been Dehradun or Mao. And Bangalore it was.
It was a benevolent fate, some godly intervention that sent you to Bangalore.
That's why.
Do you want to mention the Elephant Boy film you told me about?
Yeah, what?
The Elephant Boy film.
Oh yes, well thank you for reminding me because I've got it right here. Yes, this was of course the effective introduction, but right now this film was shot, and this is of course where the sort of top and the tail of the story come together, because where part of the film was shot was a place in Karnataka, which I will revert to later, called Melkote, northwest of Mysore. Wonderful place, right on top of a great rock. And indeed, the Elephant Boy film was shot there. And Rajani, to whom I'll come back near the end, she's now a professor, I had the privilege of meeting her grandfather, and she recorded his memoirs in Kannada, of course, of helping the film crew in Melkote dig one of their vehicles out of predictable mud in the muddy road. This was in the 30s, remember. And my father had taken me to this film called Elephant Boy when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and the memory stuck. Now, this, David, as you'd appreciate, was purely childish, pictorial memory. But I do have, for better or worse, an eidetic memory, and so that this stayed with me. But the real beginning was the one, of course, that I've told you, because it was music that was the incentive. And dare I say, music that has been the principal fuel. You could say that, how shall I put it, that the seeing the film was the upper cylinder lubricant or the oil or whatever, but the real go was music. And to that end, I went to various shops in Bangalore. I could take you to where they are now. One's a government emporium in Mahatma Gandhi Road. Used to be a record shop. And I bought my first record made by M.S. Subbulakshmi in October 1946. And it was a record of the Tamil piece in Bhairavi Raga, that is Vandadu Shole. No, not Bhairavi, I beg your pardon, Hari Kambaji. My memory's slipping. Hari Kambaji. And if you had said to me then, one day MS will sign that record for you. I would never have believed it.
Yeah.
David, it happened. And I collected, while I was in the army, I collected, I should think 80 or 90 old black 78 RPM shellac records. And
Where are
as
they today?
what?
Where are they today?
In my house.
Hmm.
Here in England. They're still there. And my son James, who of course I must thank also because he's been the, shall we say, the interlocutor between me, who has no computer or anything like that, and of course our Shruti Chakravarti. And so James has managed all the stage work, as it were.
John,
So,
do you want to tell us about coming back to England and going to
yes,
SOAS and
I'll come to
Thompson, your teacher?
a rather slow roundabout way. My children constantly complain I'm constantly heading off into things. The army, of course, because we were becoming, and when I say we, I mean India, becoming independent in August 1947, any non-essential army personnel were being shifted out of India, and I was shifted from India, in fact, to Burma. And I spent the next 10 months, that is April 1947 up to January 48, I spent in a vehicle park. We were selling off surplus army vehicles, 10,000 of them. And I was there with Indian Army personnel, what we call Jawans. I was there for the next 10 months, one of whom taught me to read Telugu script. So by the time I came back to England, I'd already learnt the Tamil script, paradoxically, while I was in Bangalore. But Telugu I learnt in the army, both, of course, in the army, excuse me. And I spent the next 10 months collecting more gramophone records, not only in this thing in Burma, a place called Morbi, about 30 miles north of Rangoon. And James's brother, Malcolm, has been regaling me with aerial pictures of Morbi, which is now apparently a Burmese Air Force fighter squadron. It was an old airport during the war and after the war. And we had our vehicles there. And as I say, in between, I was still collecting records and listening to All India Radio's overseas service. I can't say that I had any practical training at this point, but several brother officers were from either Tamil Nadu or Andhra. And so I learnt about Carnatic music quite a bit. So, I mean, I knew who Tyagaraja was, for instance, and all that sort of thing. And so this went on. I was finally posted to Singapore, by then to a British Army unit. And I remember very well on the ship going from Rangoon to Singapore, January the 30th, 1948, hearing the dreadful news of the murder of Gandhiji. I was actually on a troop ship when I heard that, and I remember it so well. The last few months in Malaysia, I happen to say, I'm afraid to say, I didn't really care for very much. I hankered to get back to India. I was like any other Brit in Burma or in Malaysia. I took no interest really in the culture for its own sake. I honestly have to say that I was just sort of completely run-of-the-mill. I had already, dare I use a sentimental expression, lost my heart to South India. And I will illustrate that in a minute, if I may. So, May 48, and I remember the date so well. This is why I remember the date of Israel's independence so well, because it actually happened while I was in the transit camp in Singapore, waiting for the troop ship to come back to England. And so I was shipped out someday in late May, I think, 48. And of course, coming from Singapore, we rounded Kanyakumari at night in the Indian Ocean, and I could see the light of the lighthouse at Kanyakumari from the
Right.
ship. And forgive me, David, because it shows my feeling about India, by which time, you see, I'd been out of India for over a year. Okay? And admittedly with Indians a lot of the time, but I wrote this poem, which I found quite recently. I've forgotten I'd even written it. And if you don't mind, I'll read it to you.
Please.
It's entitled simply Kanyakumari. So evidently I'd learnt already what the correct name for Cape Comorin was. The flight of I beg your pardon, I'll start again. The light of Kanyakumari is held out to guide me. The fruitful hand of India is there to protect me. Cloud rack gathers to cover Kanya and myself and keep me in the path of good. What can take the place of thee, sweet land, who now art so close to me? Who can picture the dawn over Pyrenees heights, the sweet torrents and fragrant woods? Thou art the ancient land of Brahma, Shiva's heritage, cruelly beset, raped by foes, savage hordes from the north. Someday, Surya's chariot shall sweep into the sky, and lo, a wondrous sight. A Chandragupta shall have arisen and scattered thine enemies to flight.
What love for India you had. It's amazing.
That was how I felt as an ignoramus just leaving the army, literally by sea, and coming back to England.
So what happened when you got back to England?
Well, I'm coming to that right now. I'm sorry that I do have to look at my notes. When I came back to England, by then it was mid-June 1948, I have to say the first thing I did was to book a train and go to the south of France for a month and sort of recover from the shock of coming back to England in 1948. Bread rationing, coal rationing, you name it. I didn't know what to do with myself. Eventually, I found SOAS. I think that's the best way to put it, because I was actually looking for a job in the library, in a library, and I applied for it totally unqualified and was turned down. However, I gathered that they had engaged a teacher, one MSH Thompson, to teach Tamil and Telugu. Now, Telugu, of course, was my initial choice for a whole year because of Tyagaraja. You can blame him for all this sort of thing. As a Tamilian yourself, as it were. So Tyagaraja won out, and I learnt Telugu for a year with Thompson, and took a first year certificate and somehow passed it. But there was no degree course in Telugu at that time. Now, Thompson had in fact studied Tamil under revered teachers such as Uwe Saminada Iyer, whom I don't need to tell you about at all who he was. He was the doyen of Tamil scholars at that time. And Thompson studied at Presidency College, Madras, and certainly at that time was the only what we call European to have studied Tamil at Presidency College. And some years later, I had the privilege of going there briefly myself for 3 or 4 months. But that's another story. So Thompson initially taught me Telugu, having been principal of the Arts College in what was then called Rajamundry in what is now Andhra. At that time, of course, remember that the Telugu territory was conjoined with the old Madras Presidency.
Right.
It was all under one hat. Anyway, Thompson was my first teacher at SOAS, along with another wonderful character in a very different milieu, and that was Dr. Arnold Barker. Arnold Barker was a large Dutchman in the way that the Dutch are large in every way, both physically and emotionally, as it were. He was such a wonderful person from a completely different background in that he had studied under Gurudev in Shantiniketan, Rabindra Sangeet, and Rabindra Sangeet was his forte. And so I had this curious experience of hearing a lot of Rabindra Sangeet from Barker. But I'm afraid it didn't move me. I mean, my compass had been set, I'm afraid, long since. And he dismissed Carnatic music. I remember his favourite thing was, will you reduce everything to formula, lists and symbols and so on. That was his criticism. Thinking, of course, of something I will come to, because you've raised this in your questions, namely the famous Mela Cartas. And the Mela Cartas, in my view, are a world contribution to music. They deserve World Heritage status, the whole system. I mean, I'm, for better or worse, an advocate of the Mela Carta system. We will come to that, if we may. Now, I'm sorry I have to refresh my memory here. The other thing that happened at the same time, I'm talking 1948, was that I reacquainted myself with the BBC's Eastern Service, this time, shall we say, with a bit more under my belt. And by that time, through somebody called Sivapada Sundaram, who had been seconded by the then Radio Ceylon to the BBC, Sivapada Sundaram, therefore a Sri Lanka Tamilian from Yapanam, Jaffna, started the Tamilose, the sound of Tamil, the BBC's Tamil service, which for all I know is still going on. But Sivapada Sundaram started it in October 48. I was introduced to him. His wife was herself a singer and a veena player, and I started to learn, shall we say, bits and pieces about Carnatic music. And also, dare I say it by rote, had learnt a number of songs myself by that time. Don't ask me how bad my pronunciation was in those days. I'd rather not answer. In fact, David, since we're about it, the first time I ever sang Carnatic music in public at all was in front of about 5,000 Indian soldiers in Mengladon in Burma, celebrating Indian independence on the 15th of August 1947. That was the first time I ever felt the courage to sing, and of course the Jawans were hugely amused, partly of course because I probably pronounced everything so badly.
What were you singing? Which song?
But, we did our best. So back to the BBC then, and a great help was that Sivapada Sundaram insisted on my learning Tamil to at least read and write fluently enough to be able to broadcast on the Tamil service. And I gave a number of broadcasts on the history of Western music for the Tamilose, as it was called. Again, I fear I have to look at my notes. The other place that I frequented in those days, life being so much more relaxed security-wise, was of course in Aldwych, that is our Indian High Commission, and I was in and out of the Aldrich High Commission like a rabbit out of a hat. I was constantly going there, and they were so nice. And the then PA to the then High Commissioner was one lady, Kamalini Sitaraman, who herself was a vocalist and actually came and sang in our house in Wimbledon, where I was living with my parents. As an undergraduate, I had no wish whatever to live in gigs or by myself. I was quite content, thank you very much, to stay at home. And so Kamalini came to our house and sang. I'm trying to remember the name of the critic that she sang. I remember another one, I'll come to later. But they were very accommodating. I met the people in the education department at the High Commission, and one officer there connected now with the lawyer family help. I meant to make a note of this. Hold on, sorry. Yes, I haven't actually mentioned his name. ASP Iyer, that's right, Panchabakesh Iyer, a lawyer family. His son-in-law or his nephew was an education officer at the High Commission, and he knew people at Anomaly University and persuaded them to offer me a scholarship, residence and tuition at Anomaly University. And I duly went there for the first time as we say in India, as a bachelor. I mentioned that deliberately. I went there.
What year was that?
1950, this was, the age of 23.
Yeah.
Now this began, dare I say, David, the first of my, shall we say, rather irritating habit of being determined to do my own thing. I had taken the first year exam for the degree, which was called the intermediate, and it consisted, among other things, of course, Sanskrit, Tamil, and Indian history. Well, with Indian history, I was okay on ancient and medieval, papers 1 and 2. Paper 3, which was about the British period in India, bored the hide off me, to be very frank. And I felt I knew enough about my own kindred here without wanting to find out about them anywhere else, even worse. And so I failed that paper. And according to the rubrics, I should have stayed at home. But I said, no, I've been offered this scholarship to the Music College at Anomaly, and to Anomaly I'm going, even if it means I've got to take the whole degree year all over again. So be it. I couldn't afford my passage going and coming, but my mother, who was one of those sort of people nowadays you call a networker, she knew everybody. And she manipulated one of the chairmen of the shipping lines. In those days, they were powerful people, a bit like Richard Branson or somebody like that. And she got round one of them to sign me on a cargo ship that was going to India when I wanted to go. I didn't have to join the Seamen's Union. I had to do a certain minimal amount of work. It gave me, among other things, my first experience of people talking Scots Gaelic, which I'd never heard before because the crew was mostly from Scotland. It was a Scottish-based line. And so we sailed ultimately from Glasgow with 2 locomotives welded to the deck to India in August 40. Now, where are we getting to? August 1950, I should say. And I was at Anomaly for 3 or 4 months. I'd also, through great good fortune, been invited as a state guest for the Mysore Dasara thing in September, October. So I went there as a state guest. That was a great experience. And I wouldn't have missed this for anything, SOAS or no SOAS. And so I went to Mysore as well. And of course, I knew my saw indirectly already through Bangalore. But of course, the main thing I have to say, David, that happened in Anomaly University was meeting the family of one K.V. Ratnam Iyer.
Yeah.
K.V. Ratnam Iyer, probably that type of generation probably may no longer exist. But they were what are called Virastars.
I want to show you something.
Yes, okay.
I keep this picture on my desk.
Oh, that's right, that's him. Oh,
Yes, in Nepatur in the village.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
Did you take that picture or did I?
I took it.
Oh, great. So, of course, do forgive me, Manikavam, I had forgotten that you had also met him. Well, then you know what a sort of person he was.
You sent us to him, Eileen and me.
Among other things, Uttaravu Kodatar, you did as you were told when he said something. And at the end of the first evening, I was taken to meet him by the Veena teacher at Anomaly Music College, Gomati Shankara Iyer. And he took me, he said, there's a local gentleman wants to meet you. And I went to his house in the village, Anomaly Nagar, behind the village, behind the university, I went to meet him there. The conversation, I may say, was entirely in English. It was interesting, and he said, straight out that he wanted his children to learn Hindi and English. That was the thing, in our new India, as then was. At the end of the evening, he drew himself up and he said, "You will call me Anna like my children. You will come to my house every evening." And, being not long out of the army, I thought I'd say, "Yes, sir." Anyway, and it was the beginning of a lifelong friendship and inspiration. And if, David, I needed anything to underwrite and back up the poem that I read you earlier, that did it. There was no question then, all the things that were dangled before people of my generation and avocation at SOAS and all that, Foreign Office, British Council, Arts Council, forget it. Somehow or other, I had to get an appointment at SOAS, so thereby, able to pursue my love of South India and the whole culture, which I had been privileged incredibly to come in contact.
During that year at Anomaly, during that year, you also met many of the great musicians, did you not?
Well, I did. I'm coming to them in due course. You ask about great musicians. Now, in that period, that is, where are we, August to November 1950, the only great musician I really got to know was G.N. Balasubramaniam, vocalist. He was top of his profession. He had been Astana Vidwan, a court musician in the old state of what is now Kerala, Travancore. And he was a very nice person indeed. Oddly enough, he graduated originally in English. He took to music a bit later in life rather than as a child, but he was so friendly and so accommodating, and I spent quite a lot of time with him.
How did you meet him? How did you meet him?
How did I meet him? Yes. Now, this, of course, brings me to the other Iyer family, that, in fact, of course, like all Iyers, as you know, they're all related to each other, but don't ask me how. Leela Gopalan Leela Gopalan's what we call cousin brother was one Vishwanathan, and Vishwanathan worked in All India Radio Madras, and it was through him that I met GNB. He was in fact himself a Shishya of GNB. Now, Leela Gopalan also came to our house. She was in England. Her husband was a journalist. And they helped set up what became Press Trust of India. And so Leela Gopalan was in this country, and jumping ahead was a tremendous help to my dear wife Wendy in a year or two's time, which I'm coming to. And anyway, so I met GNB through Vishwanathan, but I can't say that I met any other distinguished musicians, not at that time. They were still awesome figures at a distance. Okay? So that being so, when was it? November 1950, I came back to England. I could afford to pay for my passage one way back, so I came back in a passenger ship. Oddly, SS Himalaya, believe it or not, and resumed the year at SOAS. Again, rather as in my first return, I'm not at all happy to be back here, especially at the beginning of winter. But all that changed. I mentioned that I had wanted a job in the library at SOAS. Well, guess what? The following year, I met Wendy. Wendy was a junior assistant in the library at SOAS, and somehow or other we got to know each other, and jumping ahead, of course, some couple of years later, we got married. But Wendy was a junior figure in the library at SOAS. Oh, and quite useful at reducing your fines if you had overdue books, bless her. And I'm only sorry that Wendy herself now can't be participating in this interview, because she is the person you should really talk to. Because from this time on, be under no doubt of what an enormous help she was to me. One way and another. We got engaged in, February 1952, and we were married the following year. Now, while we were engaged, David, and this will appeal to your other language, she learnt Sanskrit for a year at SOAS. And out of the 12 students who started the course, there was only one who had the intellectual guts and stamina to stand it, and that was Wendy. And I found not so long ago her Sanskrit notes, and if you saw how thorough she was compared with her future husband, she puts him to shame. It was remarkable in so many ways. I shall come back to Wendy at several points, because as I say, she ought to be here, in some ways more than me. And she was very much the powerhouse at that time. So I went back to, I forgot to tell one story, this would amuse you, about Anna. Anna said the reason he was intrigued by me was, here is a young English boy, remembering there were no tourists in India in those days. Any young Brit must have been working for the High Commission or the British Council or something. So, who is this English boy studying in the music college, dressed as a Muslim, and coming to our temple? As you know, there is a Pada Petrastalam, Pashupatishvara in the village behind Anomaly. I'm sure you know it. And I used to go there every day and sit with the Nagaswaram player. He took his Nagaswaram to pieces. The Tavil player took his Tavil to pieces. And I drew drawings, which I still have, of both. And I had a whale of a time going there every day. But Anna couldn't make this out at all. So, of course, the bit that you would be amused, dressed as a Muslim. Now, in the army, having spent 10 months in Burma, I had adopted the Burmese lungi.
Oh.
Lungi itself is a Burmese word anyway, it's not anybody else's. What you might call a sarong otherwise. And they are, as you know, a characteristic checkerboard pattern. And this checkerboard pattern is worn by fishermen on the east coast of India, all the way down from Orissa right down to Tamil Nadu, where the Paratava community are in Madurai district and Ramnad and that's what they see. And so that was why he thought dressed as a Muslim, because they're virtually all Muslims, these fisher folk. So that intrigued him. Well, I explained that, of course, in terms of Burma. It has nothing to do with anything else. And of course, the temple visit was in connection with music. The English bit, well, that's the bit that, is one's lot. So that was that. And I'm sorry, I forgot to tell that story. When Wendy and I went, that is, in my case, the second visit to Anomaly, they kindly put us up in the guest house again, where I had been 3 years previously. So Wendy and I spent, let me see, November 1953 to March, April 54, with a break in Madras for Christmas, and the Music Academy. Now, it was a music academy that I first heard Subbalakshmi live, together with her violinist, whose name was, I think, T.L. Venkataram Iyer, I think so. Anyway, T stood for Tiruvallankardu, which I'll come back to in a minute. Now, as with many musicians, David, he had a repertoire of faces and grimaces that he made. And remembering that our dear Wendy was 19, newly out from England, and of course the spectacle of his grimaces was too much for a young girl, and I had to hide her behind a pillar so that he could still see Subbalakshmi, but couldn't see the violinist. And some months later, I met him, because Leela Gopalan, whom I've already mentioned, her village was Bhaskara again in God's own country, that is the same.
Yes, exactly.
And we went and stayed there, and Tiruvallankardu is just a mile or so, and Sundaresh Iyer was there. Yes, Sundaresh Iyer was his name, I got it wrong, and sent for me. So Wendy and I went to his house. Now, Wendy, remember what I told you, and because he kindly asked me to sing for him. And I thought, my God, I mean, figuratively, it's as close to me as you are. And how are we going to survive without giggling? Do you see? You know, David, there wasn't a single gesture. He was perfectly calm, Satvika Madhuri. Okay? And so I realized that this was part of the histrionics of performance, if you like, that it actually goes with the territory. Rather like, you could say, some operatic singers in the West. It's that sort of prima donna-ish general attitude.
John, you came to know Subbalakshmi well, did you not?
I came to know Subbalakshmi well, although again, I'm sorry I have to defer this still, I can't recall meeting Subbalakshmi at that time. Whom I did meet was an equally eminent singer, that is D.K. Patamal.
Oh.
And she was, in a way, she was a more understated character than Subbalakshmi. She hadn't got the same, not flair isn't the right word that I want, persona, that's it. And I met her because through, again, Gopalan's family, I had met T.L. Venkatarama Iyer, who actually was a lawyer, and he became eventually a judge of our Supreme Court in Delhi. And apart from his law, he was the acknowledged expert at that time on a person whose music I had got very interested in, and that is Muthuswami Dikshiter. So some people referred to me in those days as a Dikshiter freak, because I was keen on Dikshiter pieces, and I had wanted to learn some, and I learned Santana Ramasamy in Hindola Vasantam and Vrindavana Saraga Rangapura Vihara.